In this video, we're going to look at sum to product and product to sum identities. We're going to start by writing a product of trig functions as a sum of trig functions. Now, for these identities, we're going to need the angle sum and difference identities that we talked about in a previous video. So we're going to, for our first derivation, going to look at using the cosine sum formula or identity with the cosine difference identity as well. So we've talked in the past that the cosine, when we add two angles and take the cosine of it, your angle sum for cosine is cosine of the first times the cosine of the second minus the sine of the first times the sine of the second. And for the difference identity for cosine, it's the cosine of the first times the cosine of the second plus the sine of the first times the sine of the second. So if we add these two results together, on the left-hand side here, cosine of a plus b plus the cosine of a minus b, the b's don't cancel out because they are they're arguments of this cosine function. So on the left-hand side, we have cosine of a plus b plus cosine of a minus b. But on the right-hand side, the sine a sine b that's negative cancels out the sine a sine b that's positive. So these expressions here will cancel out, but cosine A cosine B plus cosine A cosine B is 2 cosine A cosine B. And then dividing both sides by 2 to get cosine A cosine B by itself, we get cosine A cosine B is half the sum of cosine of A plus B and cosine of A minus B. So the cosine of A times the cosine of B is half the sum of cosine of A plus B plus the cosine of A minus B. And we'll see these in used a lot in Calculus 2 with integrating trig functions in using some of these identities. So other product to sum identities that are very similar in how we arrive at them. First, we have sine A sine B is half the difference of cosine of A minus B minus cosine of A plus B. So sine A times sine B, which again we can use the angle sum and differences for sine, is half cosine A minus B minus cosine of A plus B. Sine A cosine B, so if we take the sine of one angle and multiply it by the cosine of the other, we get half the sum of the angle sum for sine and the angle difference for sine. So sine A cosine B is half the sum of the sine of A minus B and the sine of A plus B. So example 1, we're going to write cosine 2 theta times cosine 6 theta as a sum. So in Calc 2 or BC Calc, you might see this in an integration problem. So cosine 2 theta times cosine 6 theta is half the sum of the cosine of 2 theta plus 6 theta, and then the cosine of 2 theta minus 6 theta. So we get half of cosine of 8 theta plus cosine of negative 4 theta. And because cosine of negative 4 theta is the same as the cosine of 4 theta, we get our final answer is half the sum of cosine of 8 theta plus the cosine of 4 theta. All right, so that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.